Well, welcome everybody to Military Aviation History. I'm Chris and let's talk about the Russian Air Force and their operations in Ukraine. Well, strictly speaking, it's the Russian Aerospace Forces, the VKS, but you get the picture. Now, their performance over in Ukraine until this very moment has been called relatively poor by many observers, or very poor indeed. So I thought, you know what, let's break that down a little bit, talk about the problems that the Russian Air Force have, maybe also talk a little bit about the Ukrainian Air Force and what's going on there. And to assist me in this, I have also invited a couple of experts to give their opinion there, so you get a more well-rounded picture. So 3 important things before we start. First of all, we are in a developing situation. Things can change, and that is why I have added timestamps to the interviews to let you know when they were filmed. And as well as that, I am filming this very episode right now on the 3rd of March at 11 a.m. Just so you know, that's sort of where the information cutoff is. As well as that, with the Ukraine, it is, like I said, a developing situation. So there's going to be a lot of speculation that is about what is happening over there right now. It's very hard to get an accurate picture. In 2-3 weeks time, or even in a couple of months time, we will know more and partially maybe have better answers to the ones that I can provide now. And then the last thing, of course, from the Ukraine, we're seeing an information warfare happening as well online, with the information that is being transmitted from the Ukraine through social media, also Russia, through social media and their channels. And it's very hard to sort of find good, accurate information, and also to sometimes validate some of the footage that we're seeing. So I'm keeping the footage use from Ukraine, from the conflict, to an absolute minimum, because I want to avoid showing something wrong. As well as that, I should highlight right at the start certain things like the Ghost of Kiev story, which I understand why it happened, why there's sort of the mythology that occurred around it, but it has now been proven, to be incorrect. Now, the first moves that the Russian had went more or less as expected. You would assume them to knock out static radar positions to decrease the Ukrainian early warning system. That's what they did. They used mainly cruise missiles and ballistic missiles for this, an opening barrage that essentially knocked out the Ukrainians' early warning systems. As well as that, they targeted air defense systems like, for example, the S-300 batteries. That's a ground or surface-to-air missile system, of course. And as well as that, they targeted runways and airports in order to crater the actual runways, and obviously also in the aim of destroying planes that were parked on the airfields. And they've done some of that as well, although they seem to have been a little bit less successful in that regard. Now, the next step that we expected to see is the Russian Air Force and the Russian forces focusing specifically on the air assets that the Ukrainians have left, namely going after the remaining bases as well as going after all the aircraft with an offensive counter-air campaign, as well as, of course, the remaining air defense systems as well. But from what we have seen really in Ukraine, that didn't happen. And since then, it appears that, well, the VKS has shown to have a good number of problems. So let's go into those first. The first surprise is perhaps that the Russians have not used their most modern and sophisticated platforms in that great number just yet. We've seen very limited use of Sukhoi 44 models or Sukhoi 45 models, and although there seems to be a little bit of an increase in there, we really have not seen these aircraft going after the Ukrainian Air Force in both air-to-ground and air-to-air respectively. The second surprise is really the absence of the VKS in general so far. So we have seen, of course, early on strikes by Sukhoi 25 models. There are some recorded incidents there, and they seem to have conducted some limited air-to-ground strikes as well. But overall, the Russians seem to be mostly focused on using helicopters and gunships in their air operations, and they have launched some, turns out now, rather foolish perhaps, operations in trying to secure forward bases, for example, with the Hospital airport, which ended in a disaster for them. The third surprise then is that between the opening barrage of missiles and then really the main activity of the Russian Air Force, we have seen them giving the Ukrainian Air Force a breathing space of 1 or 2 days, which really has allowed the Ukrainians to, first of all, get a grip on the situation and also fly their own strikes relatively unopposed which has of course then caused some of those stories to occur, like for example the Ghost of Kiev story, which has been disproven. But the limited activity of the VKS has really kept that vacuum open for the Ukrainian Air Force then to launch their own operation. And this is really a surprise, because if you want to make an offensive counter-air campaign work, then not only do you have to carry out that opening barrage, but you really have to keep the wings on the ground and destroy them there. And that really has only occurred in very limited instances. The next surprise, and it sort of latches on to the ones previously mentioned, is the limited fighter cover that the Russian Air Force has provided has allowed the Ukrainians to fly their own defensive counter-air missions against helicopters, even conduct some air-to-ground strikes against Russian troops. And really, the Ukrainian air defenses have also been able to focus mainly on relatively easier targets like helicopters or helicopter gunships, rather than having to sort of jostle and wrestle with Russian Air Force assets. And that has allowed perhaps the Ukrainians to pool their assets a little bit more and have more conducted or more coordinated and more concentrated defensive counter-air measures in place against this Russian assault than would otherwise have been the case if they would have come in with sort of an overwhelming air presence. And then the Russian ground troops, next to the fact that they didn't really have fighter cover for a couple of days, seem to have pushed often ahead of their own air defenses, or when they had air defenses with them, didn't activate them, didn't use them, didn't really employ them correctly. And that has allowed, again, the Ukrainian Air Force to conduct a couple of strikes. That has also enabled drone strikes, specifically drone strikes also against Russian air defense assets. So now let's talk a little bit about sort of the reasons why these problems exist for the Russian Air Force. But before that, I of course also want to say that I look forward to all your comments. Let me know what you think about the ongoing situation, how you're analyzing this situation, your opinions, your feedback, your additions. I look forward to them in the comment section below. And of course, if you like these analysis videos, if you want to see more, also consider supporting over on channel memberships, for example. That gives you early access to videos, sneak peeks as well. And also we have a Discord server with bi-monthly meetings where we get to chat about all things aviation related, which is really cool. Do check that out also as well in the description below. But yeah, let's talk about the Russian Air Force. What are the reasons for this perceived failure, this perceived lack of activity that we have there down in the Ukraine? I'm not sure. I mean, that's the thing. I want to preface this again. Nobody is really sure. But let's talk about some of the indications that we have and break it down from there, because, hey, no one of us has a crystal ball. So one of the problems that the Russians might have right now is the fact that their Air Force is really sort of split into two specializations. You have the air-to-air specialization with Sukhoi models 27, 35s, 30s as well. And then you have the air-to-ground component, and there, of course, the Frogfoot, the Su-25 plays a strong role, as well as, of course, more modern Sukhoi 34s. But between those two forces, which are really specialized in their specific bracket, you have very little multi-role experience, which now appears to show because they are wrestling with a dynamic situation that they really have not planned for and that they don't really appear to have the assets for. Next to this limited experience with multi-role, we also have some indication that the flight hours that Russian pilots have are sometimes less than half of what Western counterparts have, especially over in the US, which again seems to indicate that there is a problem. They are trying to keep those pilots really experienced and really in tune with the platforms they're operating. Of course, considering this lack of flight hours and also this lack of multi-role experience doesn't mean that the VKS is just a dull sword. On the contrary, I mean, against static targets, against fixed targets, against pre-planned targets, the Russian Air Force, especially with their Frogfoots, with the Sukhoi 34 models, can bring firepower to the table. However, in the situation that was unfolding in the first couple of days of the Russian offensive, we seem to be in a situation where those targets really don't exist. The Ukrainians seem to be operating more flexible, smaller scale units, sometimes or very often well concealed. They're maneuvering a lot, and the Russian Air Force is simply not equipped in a way that, for example, a Western Air Force would be equipped and able to operate against that dynamic threat and being always able to sort of change their target on the fly. Of course, when we talk about the latest Sukhoi models, there is also the fact that the Russian Air Force does have a lack of targeting pods, or of good quality targeting pods. I mean, they do have those retractable ones, right, that have sort of a forward-facing cone of vision. And they don't really have that much experience with guided munitions as well, so PGMs, except for a small core of pilots. And it has been rumored that the stockpile of Russian PGMs is relatively small, which would indicate or give further evidence the fact of why they're using unguided bombs and more and unguided rockets as well in the majority of their strikes as well. And on top of that, it does look like we are seeing that lack of experience also with calling in air support. So one of the things that the Russians seem to lack is, coordination and communication between ground assets as well as their air assets, using something like a forward air controller or a JTAC. And that means there are even fewer chances for air and ground to cooperate during this operation. Then the sort of second reason we might bring to the table is that because the planning of this operation was in such a way that a massed formation of the Russian army would be marching into the Ukraine, that the Russian Air Force was perhaps a little bit worried, also because of that lack of coordination with ground forces, that by sending in many aircraft, they're going to be susceptible to friendly fire from over-happy, trigger-happy air defense platforms that move alongside the advancing Russian columns. That is one speculation that we might have had. Of course, it requires a lot of coordination between air defense assets as well as air assets in order to create sort of spaces where air assets operate freely or mixed, or air defense assets are used uniquely. And perhaps there was simply not enough time to really develop that coherent system in the run-up of this operation. And that, of course, brings me to the next point, and that is the limited time to plan. It appears from sort of the things we hear over from the Russian preparation of this operation that it really was conducted within the preparation, generally speaking, was conducted within a week or maybe 2 weeks at maximum. And that is very little time in order to get an Air Force actually ready to conduct such an operation. It's not just about just having the planes ready on the runway, it's also about building up the stockpiles for the individual air regiments to use. You have to develop pre-flight plans, you have to, like I said, integrate it into the wider operation, and maybe that just there wasn't just the time for that. That's possible. And then one of the other things that one of the conversations I had with an expert, Richard Chimuka, over from the McLaurier Institute in Canada, he actually stressed that maybe this is also indicative of more structural problems, more systemic problems in not just the Russian Air Force, but also in the Russian defense industry.
Russian modernization has been a huge topic, right? You see, talking about new concepts like A2AD, new systems that are being developed, which, Vladimir Putin has been very happy to kind of show off and extol, right? Yeah. And, then you go see it operations like in Syria and whatnot, you see a developing competency that kind of, I wouldn't say rivals the West, but certainly, apes some of those kind of developments, and we're developing reconnaissance concepts and all that, right? Yeah. And then this happens. Air defense that doesn't seem to exist. The Russian Air Force is MIA, is nowhere near like what they should be able to do. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. It kind of begs the questions like, well, is that really the reality of the actual armed forces? As a broader point, in my sort of research or understanding of it, I've never really fully understood the Russian defense economy. It just seems that there's so much they have to do with so little. Like this is 10th, 11th largest kind of economy worldwide. This is an economy that's smaller than Germany. They have a very large submarine force and navy, which they are spending more and more on. They have a huge nuclear weapons arsenal. Right. Then you have this army that's extremely large, these all cost money. These all cost resources. And you have, I think it's somewhere around $40 billion a year, something around that for their day, especially since 2014, they've been under a sanctions regime. Right. And so their ability to take things from the West, or not take, but certainly buy or acquire sensitive military technology isn't there. Whereas, in the United States or whatnot, you have a large civil sector that can provide dual use technologies like, jet engines and whatnot, right? And Russia doesn't have access to that. So when you understand the scale of this, right? You were always kind of wondering, well, what is there? And that doesn't even get into the other kind of the elephant in the room is, what about Russian corruption? Like, this is, Transparency International, I think it rated this as one of the most corrupt states in the world, right? And there's no reason why the defense sector would not be afflicted by anything. It should be worse, because this is a state enterprise, most largely made out of state-funded enterprises. So you would noticeably see that there. And so now we've seen this in practice. Now we've actually seen, Russian operations in practice in full relief, where they can't really control the message, and it's really ugly, right? It's, you're just looking at equipment that just looks dilapidated, right, in a lot of cases, right? And decisions and operations that just seem shoddily planned and shoddily executed. And I get the point, like, this is, they've been given a very limited amount of time and that, but a lot of that, even that can't explain some of this.
Another reason that I've seen some people say is that Russia knew that perhaps there is a risk of running into more severe opposition than they expected, and that they're limiting the forces that they used in the initial strikes. Maybe they even expected NATO to take a more hard line. To be honest, I'm a little bit doubtful of that, whether that's really the case, but perhaps it does indicate the fact that next to some other reasons why the Russian Air Force doesn't really show up, maybe they do keep certain very specific assets like the Sukhoi 34s and the Sukhoi 35s more in reserve to see really what is going to happen. They just expected their other platforms to be enough for this type of operation. And finally, and I just mentioned this for the sake of inclusion, maybe they just assumed that the Ukraine is going to collapse within 20, 48 or 72 hours. Maybe that was their assumption. Maybe they just said, well, we don't really need to plan any sort of really detailed airstrike package for this operation. Maybe that factors into it as well. It's worth remembering, really, that the Russian Air Force has roughly 300 aircraft in striking distance of Ukraine. And that is the amount of firepower that the VKS can theoretically, depending on whether these assets are prepared, can use in the coming days and perhaps weeks. And there is, of course, the worry that now that Ukrainian resistance has been very strong, that the VKS is going to take a more heavy-handed approach and also going to be dropping munitions not just on battlefield targets, so in the open field, but we have also seen more bombing of course, cities. And that has caused the conflict to escalate even further. But much of what we're going to be perhaps seeing in the coming days and weeks will depend on the preparations the Russian Air Force does at this very point in time. And that is going to define the options they have in the air, as well as how they're going to be supporting the assets they have on the ground. In order to give you another opinion of how things might evolve in the air domain between both the Russian Air Force as well as the Ukrainian Air Force, I've also invited Justin Bronk from the Royal United Services Institute to give his analysis of the situation.
But we're likely to see, a sort of continued drumbeat of bombing against the encircled cities, particularly Kharkiv and Mariupol, in the coming days, and potentially Kiev once the assault on that actually gets underway. But it may well be that it continues to be in kind of quite small waves, with quite small numbers of aircraft dropping mostly unguided weapons from medium or higher altitude. And at medium or higher altitude, they are vulnerable to the remaining Ukrainian surface-to-air missile threat, which is basically SA-11, some SA-8, so Buk and Goa, plus a few SA-15s, including one that they captured. Whether they can use it or not, I don't know. And if the Russians don't have the capacity to do what, against that sort of threat, an air force like the US Air Force or even the RAF, or particularly someone like the Israelis would do, which is fly in large enough numbers with decent self-defense packages and with stand-in jamming capabilities or standoff jamming protection from something like a Growler or a Prowler to bait out a launch if there is a threat there. And then when something does launch, to immediately attack it with all the other aircraft in the region. But if the Russians aren't comfortable operating in really big strike packages that would enable them to have this sort of overlapping cover with escorting fighters with in effect SEAD capability, even if it's with unguided weapons, then they may not be able to do that. And either they'll continually take a low level of losses, or they might have to do what they're doing currently, just at a larger scale, which is operate at low level. But you're right in the threat range for all of the manpads, so the shoulder-fired Stingers and Iglas, which not only do the Ukrainians have quite a few of already, but have been being supplied actively over the last few days by Western countries. If they can't actually pull themselves together and do a proper SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses campaign, to hunt, find, isolate, and hunt down those remaining medium-range threats, then we might see a fairly uncoordinated VKS action. Equally, it may be that I'm wrong, and perhaps they are just holding back because they were so unprepared that it's taken them a week to spin things up, and they may come into operation in larger numbers and do something more like what we expected. The Ukrainian Air Force has put up a magnificent defensive show in the sense that they're continuing to fly, although they've taken very heavy losses. Their fast jets have been restricted to flying very, very low altitude sorties because the Russian long-range air defense threat and initially presumed fighter threat meant that basically to be survivable, they had to fly very low. And they're continuing to do that. What that means is that their kind of situational awareness picture is pretty limited, especially given that they've lost their ground-based radars, although they may well be getting some measure of early warning from NATO. They've had success with the TB2s, the Bayraktar TB2 UAVs. This is more evidence of a really, really poor level of coordination between Russian ground-based air defense troops and the rest of the army than it is any particularly notable kind of attributes of the TB2. So they've managed to, in the first few days in particular, managed to surprise Russian SAM units, a couple of SA-11s, which were just apparently inactive in traffic jams or in kind of holding points in forests, which again points to very, very poor morale and organization on the part of the Russians, because if you're stuck in a column with potential air attacks coming in, even if it's just UAVs, and you're operating a SAM system, why on earth wouldn't you have your radar going? And so they seem to have been totally unaware in most of these videos that the TB2 was there. But in the last few days, we're seeing the Russians move a lot more air defense forward, kind of sort themselves out a lot in that sense. So, for example, the large columns going towards Kiev are now a very, very difficult target for the Ukrainian Air Force, because there's a lot of air defense along that column. And also because it's relatively near within the sort of coverage at medium altitudes of the S-400 systems along the Belarusian Ukrainian border. Any conventional fast jet attacks with, say, Sukhoi 25s, which they have a few left, or 24s, or there's for example, cannon or bomb attacks with their MiG-29s or Sukhoi 27s, would have to come in at very low level, conduct really very old school kind of visual weapon drops. And the amount of concentrated anti-aircraft fire and man-pads and air defense that they would encounter probably means that that's now a closed kind of option for them. So the TB2s that they have left will no doubt continue to operate in parts of the country where the air defense picture kind of gives them gaps. But I think we'll see them increasingly less effective going forward than we saw kind of in those initial few days when the Russians really just didn't have their act together.
So usually at this point I say I hope you enjoyed this episode, but given the current light, I mean, this is a conflict we could all have done without. But I do hope that you got something from this video, and if you did, let me know in the comment section below. If you want to add anything, let me know down there. Talk amongst yourself. How do you perceive the situation currently? What is going to happen? What has happened? And what's your take on all of this? I mean, hopefully there is going to be a resolution to this conflict sooner rather than later, although honestly I wouldn't know what the resolution could be at this point in time. But yeah, I hope that you got something from that. Remember, there's another episode coming out this month most likely this month, on the Messerschmitt Bf 110. I also have a video slotted up on the F-35, as well as on the greatest or the largest airborne operation during World War II. So look forward to those. And if you do want to support these kind of videos, you can do so, for example, via channel memberships, where you get certain perks. It is up to you, of course, completely voluntary.